This place was not just a camp. It was the largest site of human tragedy in human history. Behind its gates, over 1 million souls were stripped of identity, dignity, and life. This was the heart of a brutal regime's machine. A vast industrial complex of cruelty where families were torn apart on arrival ramps, where the illusion of safety ended inside rooms disguised as showers, and where unspeakable experiments were carried out in the name of ideology. This is the story of how Auschwitz became a symbol of the deepest evil the modern world has ever known, the foundation of hell. In the spring of 1940, as German forces consolidated their grip on occupied Poland, SS Oberruhr Herr Lieberhänel received orders that would transform a collection of crumbling Austrian military barracks into the most notorious killing machine in human history. The location chosen was Oświęcim, a small Polish town whose German name Auschwitz would become synonymous with industrialized murder. The site possessed a grim practicality that appealed to Nazi planners. Railroad lines converged here from across Europe like arteries feeding a malignant heart. The Vistula River provided water. Abandoned Austrian barracks offered existing infrastructure. Most importantly, the surrounding area had been cleared of its Polish population, creating a cordon of emptiness around what would become humanity's darkest theater. On April 27, 1940, Heinrich Himmler signed the order, establishing Auschwitz concentration camp. The directive was clinical in its bureaucratic language, betraying nothing of the horror it would unleash. Rudolf Höss, a career SS officer who had cut his teeth at Dachau, was appointed as the first commandant. At 39, Höss possessed the methodical temperament and ideological fervor that Nazi leadership prized. His later testimony would reveal a man capable of organizing mass murder with the same attention to detail others might apply to managing a factory. The first transport arrived on June 14, 1940. 728 Polish political prisoners packed into cattle cars. Their journey marking the beginning of Auschwitz's operational phase. Among them was Tadasowski, prisoner number 220, whose survival testimony would later document these earliest days. The prisoners were forced to construct their own prison, expanding the camp with their bare hands under the supervision of German kapos who had been transferred from other concentration camps. By the end of 1940, Auschwitz had expanded beyond its original barracks into a sprawling complex of suffering. The main camp, later designated Auschwitz I, housed approximately 10,000 prisoners in conditions designed to break both body and spirit. Wooden bunks stacked 3 high held up to 6 emaciated bodies per tier. Sanitation was deliberately inadequate. A handful of latrines served thousands of prisoners, creating breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and other diseases that would claim thousands of lives. The daily routine was calculated torture. Prisoners rose at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of whistles and barking dogs. Roll call or appel could last for hours as guards methodically counted and recounted their human inventory. Staniso Debiel later testified that prisoners were forced to stand motionless in all weather conditions, rain, snow, or blazing sun, while guards searched for any excuse to inflict punishment. Work assignments were death sentences distributed with bureaucratic efficiency. Prisoners were marched to nearby factories, construction sites, and agricultural projects under the supervision of armed guards and attack dogs. The official slogan Arbeit Macht Frei, work makes free, was emblazoned over the main gate in wrought iron letters, a mockery that greeted each prisoner's departure for their daily torment. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived Auschwitz, would later write about the psychological warfare inherent in the camp's design. Every aspect of daily life was structured to strip away human dignity. Prisoners were shaved bald, dressed in striped uniforms, and reduced to numbers tattooed on their forearms. Names disappeared. Identities dissolved. What remained were hollow-eyed figures shuffling between barracks and work sites in a carefully choreographed dance of degradation. In early 1941, Himmler approved a massive expansion of the Auschwitz complex during a visit on March 1. By autumn, construction had begun on Auschwitz II Canal, 3 kilometers from the main camp. This new facility dwarfed its predecessor in both size and sinister purpose. Spanning several square kiln, Birkenau was planned to accommodate up to 125,000 prisoners at its peak capacity. But size alone did not capture Birkenau's true significance. It was here that the Nazis would perfect their machinery of mass murder. The expansion coincided with the arrival of Soviet prisoners of war, the first large-scale group to be systematically murdered at Auschwitz. On September 3, 1941, approximately 600 Soviet PS and 250 Polish prisoners were herded into the basement of Block 11, the camp's punishment block. SS guards sealed the windows and doors, then introduced Cyclone B gas through specially drilled holes. Hearst later noted that early gassings were inefficient. Victims sometimes took longer than expected to die, requiring adjustments to the procedure. This clinical assessment of murder would become characteristic of how Nazi officials approached their task as a problem of efficiency to be solved through experimentation and refinement. Survivors later described the victims screaming fading into silence as the gas chamber emptied, a process that could take up to 20 minutes. The methodical nature of these killings revealed the bureaucratic detachment with which ordinary men participated in extraordinary evil. The perfection of murder. By early 1942, the lessons learned from those first experimental killings had been incorporated into a system of unprecedented efficiency. 4 large crematoria gas chamber complexes were constructed at Birkenau, each capable of murdering and disposing of thousands of victims daily. The facilities were designed with the same engineering precision applied to any industrial process. Crematoria 2 and 3 were identical structures, each containing an underground undressing room, a gas chamber disguised as a shower facility, and furnaces designed to cremate 1,440 bodies per day. Crematoria 4 and 5 were smaller, each with a capacity of 768 bodies daily. Together, these facilities gave Auschwitz-Birkenau a design capacity of 4,416 corpses per day. Though during peak periods, Sonderkommando prisoners reported being forced to burn up to 8,000 bodies daily through continuous operation. The deception was meticulously planned. Victims arriving by transport train were told they were being relocated for work assignments. The healthy and young were selected for slave labor. The elderly and those deemed unfit were directed to the showers. SS guards maintained the illusion until the final moment. Survivors recalled that guards sometimes handed victims soap or towels to reinforce the appearance of a harmless shower facility. Sonderkommando prisoners, Jewish inmates forced to operate the killing machinery, left behind testimonies that illuminate the horror they witnessed daily. One Sonderkommando member later wrote that he felt enslaved by the crematoria and compelled to do work that was most terrible for a human being. Philip Muller, one of the few Sonderkommando survivors, later testified that after about 10 to 15 minutes of gassing, the victims would fall silent and prisoners would be forced to drag out the corpses. His testimony reveals how Nazi efficiency transformed murder into routine industrial process. The railway ramp at Birkenau became the primary gateway to hell for Jews from across Nazi-occupied Europe. Beginning in 1942, trains arrived with clockwork regularity, each carrying between 1,000 and 3,000 victims packed into sealed cattle cars. The journeys themselves were exercises in calculated cruelty. Passengers went days without food, water, or sanitation facilities. Dr. Miklos Nasli, a Hungarian Jewish physician who was forced to perform autopsies for József Mengele, documented the arrival process with clinical precision. The train stopped with a shrill whistle. The doors were flung open, and a hail of blows from clubs and rifle butts forced the passengers to get out. In 5 minutes, the cars were empty. The selection process on the ramp followed predetermined criteria designed to maximize both immediate killing efficiency and short-term labor extraction. SS doctors led by figures like József Mengele made split-second decisions that determined life or death with a casual gesture. The elderly, pregnant women, and anyone appearing unfit for work were immediately directed toward the gas chambers. Primo Levi, the Italian chemist who survived Auschwitz, described his arrival in January 1944. In less than 10 minutes, all the fit men had been collected together in a group. What happened to the others, to the women, to the old men? We could establish neither then nor later. The night swallowed them up, pure and simple. The efficiency was staggering. Trains arrived, were unloaded, and victims were murdered within hours of their arrival. The bodies were burned, the belongings sorted and shipped to Germany, and the facilities prepared for the next transport. This cycle repeated day after day, month after month, with mechanical precision. The systematic looting of victims' possessions became a crucial component of Auschwitz operations, both economically and psychologically. A vast warehouse complex, cynically nicknamed Canada by prisoners because of Canada's association with wealth and abundance, processed the belongings of the murdered. Hundreds of prisoners worked in Canada, sorting through suitcases, clothing, eyeglasses, shoes, and personal effects of the dead. The scale was overwhelming. Mountains of human hair, tons of gold teeth, piles of wedding rings, and children's toys created a surreal landscape of interrupted lives. Abraham Dragon, a Sonda Commando member, later testified, "We found toys, photographs, and children's clothing. These things affected us more than anything else." The economic dimension of this theft was enormous. Gold and valuables were melted down and shipped to the Reichsbank. Clothing was redistributed to German civilians or sold. Even human hair was processed into felt and thread for German industry. This systematic plundering generated millions of Reichsmarks for the Nazi war effort while erasing the final traces of victims' identities. But the psychological impact on both perpetrators and surviving prisoners was equally significant. The abundance of belongings created a constant reminder of the scale of murder taking place for prisoners working in Canada. Handling the possessions of the recently murdered created a unique form of trauma. Block 10 in the main camp held a special place of infamy as the site of Nazi medical experiments. Under the direction of doctors like Karl Kloberg and Horst Schumann, this block became a laboratory for sterilization research and other pseudo-medical atrocities that violated every principle of medical ethics. Dr. Karl Kloberg, a gynecologist who had gained prominence in Nazi circles for his fertility research, was given authorization to develop methods for mass sterilization of undesirable populations. Between 1943 and 1944, he conducted sterilization experiments on approximately 700 Jewish women by injecting caustic chemicals into their reproductive organs without anesthesia. Subjects often suffered severe pain, infections, and many died from these procedures. A Jewish prisoner who worked as a medical assistant in Block 10 later testified that the women would scream from the pain of Kloberg's injections, and many developed life-threatening infections. Her testimony reveals how legitimate medical research was perverted into systematic torture. Dr. H. Schumann conducted sterilization experiments using massive doses of X-ray radiation, exposing hundreds of male and female prisoners to radiation that caused severe burns, permanent damage to reproductive organs, and death from radiation poisoning. Most victims suffered grave injuries and many died from the radiation exposure. The medical experiments extended beyond sterilization research. Doctors conducted studies on twins, dwarfs, and individuals with genetic anomalies. They performed unnecessary surgeries, infected prisoners with diseases, and conducted other experiments that served no legitimate medical purpose. These crimes represented the complete corruption of medical science in service of Nazi ideology. No figure embodied the perversion of medicine at Auschwitz than Dr. Isef Mongol, whose twin studies and genetic experiments earned him the nickname Angel of Death among prisoners. Mongol's appearance on the selection ramp became synonymous with arbitrary death sentences delivered with theatrical flourishes and casual brutality. Mongala arrived at Auschwitz in May 1943, bringing with him an obsession with genetic research that would transform hundreds of prisoners into unwilling test subjects. His particular fascination with twins led to the establishment of a special barracks where twins were housed separately from other prisoners and subjected to a range of medical procedures. Eva Moses Kaur, a survivor of Mengelé's twin experiments, later recalled in her memoir that twins received mysterious injections 3 times a week. Many became very sick, and some died from these procedures. Her testimony illuminates the fear and confusion experienced by victims who could not comprehend why they were being tortured in the name of science. Mongal's experiments included blood transfusions between twins, deliberate infection with diseases, surgical procedures without anesthesia, and attempts to change eye color through chemical injections. He dissected twins who died from his procedures, comparing their organs to search for genetic differences. The scientific value of these experiments was nil, but they satisfied Mengelé's pathological curiosity and advanced his career within the Nazi medical establishment. Witnesses described Mengelé's demeanor during selections as eerily cheerful, whistling classical music while deciding who would live and who would die. This theatrical cruelty became part of his method, demonstrating absolute power over life and death while maintaining the pretense of scientific objectivity. By October 1944, as Soviet forces approached from the east and Nazi defeat became increasingly apparent, the Jewish prisoners forced to operate the gas chambers and crematoria knew their own deaths were imminent. The Nazis had routinely murdered Sonderkommando units every few months to eliminate witnesses to the killing process. Faced with certain death, the S-Kommando began planning what would become the most significant act of armed resistance in Auschwitz history. The uprising was coordinated across all 4 crematoria, with prisoners smuggling explosives from nearby munitions factories and improvised weapons crafted from camp materials. On October 7, 1944, the revolt began when Sonderkommando at Crematorium 4 attacked their SS guards with hammers, axes, and improvised explosive devices created from smuggled gunpowder. The building was destroyed in the explosion, and several guards were killed before reinforcements arrived. Simultaneously, prisoners at Crematorium 2 overwhelmed their guards and attempted to break through the camp's perimeter fence. A Sonderkommando member whose testimony was discovered buried near Crematorium 3 after the war wrote about the uprising's preparation, expressing that they knew they were going to die, but decided it was better to die fighting than to be led to slaughter. His words capture the desperate courage required to resist in the face of overwhelming odds. The uprising was ultimately suppressed after several hours of fierce fighting. Approximately 450 S-Kommando prisoners were killed either during the revolt or in its immediate aftermath. The damaged Crematorium 4 was never repaired, representing a small but significant disruption to the Nazi killing machinery. For Polish women who had smuggled explosives to the Sonderkommando, Aligertner Estuja Viplum, Regina Safastein, and Rosa Robota were tortured and executed for their role in the uprising. Their sacrifice demonstrated the networks of resistance that existed even within the most oppressive conditions. As Soviet artillery grew audible in the distance during January 1945, SS officials began implementing plans to evacuate Auschwitz and eliminate evidence of their crimes. The systematic destruction of documents, crematoria, and other facilities accelerated as Nazi leadership recognized that their industrial murder operation would soon be exposed to the world. On January 17, 1945, the evacuation of Auschwitz began with a series of forced marches that would claim thousands of additional lives. Approximately 58,000 prisoners were forced to march westward in sub-zero temperatures, many wearing nothing but thin prison uniforms and wooden clogs unsuitable for walking on ice and snow. Primo Levi, who was too ill to join the marches and remained in the camp infirmary, later wrote about watching the departure. They left in the night in columns of 100, and we who stayed behind could hear the sound of their wooden clogs growing fainter in the distance. His observation captures the ghostly nature of this final exodus from the camp. The marches were deliberately brutal, designed to kill prisoners while moving them away from the advancing Soviet forces. Guards shot anyone who fell behind, collapsed from exhaustion, or attempted to escape. Bodies lined the roads leading west from Auschwitz, marking the final chapter of Nazi cruelty toward their victims. Survivors of the death marches reported marching for days without adequate food, water, or rest. They slept in the open during freezing nights, with many prisoners dying from exposure, exhaustion, or starvation. The fortunate ones were liberated by Allied forces. Others continued marching until they reached concentration camps deeper in Germany. The final days. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet 60th Army entered Auschwitz to discover a scene that defied human comprehension. The troops, hardened by years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, were unprepared for the evidence of systematic murder they encountered. Approximately 7,000 prisoners remained in the camp, most too sick or weak to have been evacuated. Soviet medics and photographers documented what they found. Approximately 7 tons of human hair, hundreds of thousands of pieces of clothing and shoes, and warehouses filled with the belongings of murdered victims. The scale of the evidence overwhelmed even experienced war correspondents. Captain Vasily Gromadsky, one of the first Soviet officers to enter the camp, later recalled, "We knew about Nazi atrocities, but nothing prepared us for what we saw at Auschwitz. The systematic nature of the killing, the industrial scale, it was beyond our imagination." His testimony reflects the shock experienced by liberators confronting the reality of the Holocaust. The liberation revealed not just the scope of Nazi crimes, but also their methodical documentation. SS officials had maintained detailed records of arrivals, selections, and murders, creating an administrative trail that would later prove crucial in prosecuting war criminals. These documents, combined with survivor testimony, provided irrefutable evidence of the genocide that had taken place. Dr. Otten Wulon, a prisoner physician who survived to witness the liberation, documented the medical condition of survivors. Most of the remaining prisoners were suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and starvation. Many died in the days following liberation despite our best efforts to save them. His account reveals how the effects of Nazi brutality continued to claim lives even after the camp's liberation. The precise number of victims murdered at Auschwitz remains a subject of ongoing historical research, but scholars have established parameters that convey the staggering scale of the killing. Based on Nazi transportation records, survivor testimonies, and post-war investigations, historians estimate that approximately 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz, of whom about 1.1 million were murdered at the camp complex. Approximately 960,000 of Auschwitz's victims were Jewish, about 87% of the total deaths. The largest single group consisted of Hungarian Jews, with approximately 430,000 murdered during the spring and summer of 1944. Polish Jews comprised the second largest victim group at approximately 300,000, followed by Jews from France, 69,000, Netherlands, 60,000, Greece, 55,000, Czechoslovakia, 46,000, and other occupied territories. The non-Jewish victims included approximately 74,000 Polish political prisoners, 21,000 Roma and Sinti people, 15,000 Soviet prisoners of war, and thousands of prisoners of other nationalities. These numbers, while representing enormous human tragedy, demonstrate the primarily anti-Jewish focus of Auschwitz's killing operations. The killing process was so efficient that most victims died within hours of their arrival. Of the estimated 1.3 million people deported to Auschwitz, fewer than 200,000 were registered as prisoners. The remainder were murdered immediately upon arrival, their deaths recorded only in the meticulous transportation logs maintained by Nazi bureaucrats. The operation of Auschwitz required the participation of thousands of individuals across multiple levels of Nazi hierarchy. The camp's commandants, Rudolf Höss, Arthur Lieber Henschel, and Richard Baer, provided overall leadership, but the daily implementation of murder required a vast network of SS guards, administrative personnel, and civilian contractors. Several thousand SS personnel served at Auschwitz during its operational period, ranging from senior officers to ordinary guards. The trial testimony of SS guards reveals the mundane nature of their participation in mass murder. Many described their work in clinical terms, focusing on procedural details while avoiding acknowledgement of moral responsibility. This bureaucratization of evil allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary crimes while maintaining psychological distance from their actions. Civilian contractors and corporations also played crucial roles in Auschwitz's operation. IG Farben constructed a synthetic rubber factory using prisoner slave labor. Top and Sons provided the crematorium furnaces. Deutsche Reichsbahn transported victims to the camp. These businesses profited from genocide while maintaining the fiction of normal commercial relationships. The complicity extended beyond direct participants to include bureaucrats who processed deportation orders, civil servants who arranged transportation, and citizens who witnessed deportations without protest. The machinery of murder required not just active participation, but also passive acceptance by broader society. By November 1944, Heinrich Himmler had ordered the cessation of gassings at Auschwitz as Nazi leadership recognized that the war was lost and evidence of their crimes needed to be eliminated. On November 25, 1944, Himmler specifically ordered the destruction of the Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chambers and crematoria. SS personnel forced remaining prisoners to dismantle and dynamite crematoria 2 and 3, while crematorium 4 had already been destroyed during the October Sonderkommando uprising. The final months of Auschwitz operation were marked by increasingly desperate attempts to conceal the scope of Nazi crimes. Prisoner work details were forced to dig up and burn bodies from mass graves, scatter ashes in nearby rivers, and destroy documents that might incriminate Nazi officials. The irony was bitter. The same prisoners who had been marked for death were now compelled to eliminate evidence of their persecution. Despite these efforts, the evidence was too extensive to completely erase. Prisoners had hidden documents and testimonies throughout the camp. The sheer scale of the killing operations left physical traces that could not be eliminated. Most importantly, thousands of survivors carried the truth in their memories and would later provide testimony that ensured the world would never forget what had occurred. The last transport to Auschwitz arrived on October 30, 1944, carrying 38 Jews from Theresian concentration camp. Most were immediately murdered upon arrival, representing the final act in a drama of unprecedented cruelty that had unfolded over more than 4 years. As Soviet forces approached during January 1945, the remaining SS personnel made final preparations for evacuation. The camp that had once bustled with the activity of systematic murder became a ghost of its former self, leaving behind only the physical infrastructure of genocide and the testimonies of those who had somehow survived to bear witness. The last entry in the Auschwitz death register was made on January 17, 1945, the same day the evacuation marches began. This final bureaucratic act marked the end of an institution that had redefined the possibilities of human evil while demonstrating the importance of individual resistance and the power of historical memory to preserve truth in the face of attempts at concealment. Auschwitz was built to erase lives, and yet its memory endures. Today we remember not only the horror, but the resilience of those who survived and bore witness. May their voices echo through history, reminding us of what happens when hatred is systematized and why it must never happen again. Music,